The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There has been a really interesting turnaround involving one of the wireless and mobile carriers and their position on net neutrality. Sprint has officially thrown their support behind reclassifying internet service providers under Title II and creating meaningful Title II-based net neutrality rules. In a filing with the FCC, Sprint declares that they're perfectly fine calling ISPs Title II, filing them under Title II, as long as there are rules smart enough to protect reasonable network management. That has not been an issue so far. And there are other ISPs like Verizon, AT&T, and Comcast, and we've talked to you about their position, which is that if Title II does take governance over internet service providers, that it will stifle investment in the broadband sector and that it will just be really bad, even though privately they've admitted to investors that the rules really aren't a big deal. And Sprint has come out and they've said very publicly, Title II rules done correctly will have no impact whatsoever on our willingness to invest in network infrastructure. Quote, they said, so long as the FCC continues to allow wireless carriers to manage our networks and differentiate our products, Sprint will continue to invest in data networks regardless of whether they're regulated by Title II or some other light touch regulatory regime. Now there is, if we look at the language here, there is some interesting language that we should pay attention to, which is when Sprint writes about differentiating their products, it's talking about possibly creating internet fast lanes where it can charge certain companies more money to ensure that traffic is delivered more quickly on their network. And everyone has a different definition of what light touch regulation means, right? That's a very subjective term. But still, this is huge because Sprint is the only one of these companies who has publicly said, classifying ISPs under Title II would be no big deal and we would keep making investments.
It could be that they see this as an inevitability, and perhaps in joining joining the right side of this battle early would give them some type of advantage over their competitors.
And it could be a PR thing as well, because now that Sprint has said Title II would be fine, they are directly opposed to their competitor, T-Mobile, where CEO John Legere has been making huge waves. They try to say, T-Mobile does, that they're consumer friendly, but they're opposed to Title II regulation over ISPs, which is actually something that would be good for consumers. So it could be a pretty good PR move for Sprint as well. And that would be particularly logical, as if you suggest, Lewis, they see this as an inevitability. They might as well get ahead of the PR curve while they can.
Yeah, I'm sure factored into this decision that there is the ultimate goal of profit. But maybe not. Maybe they see themselves being at the same place regardless of this legislation.
And the other reason that this is a big deal is that when you have an entire industry, every player in an industry united behind one position on a particular issue, it's much harder to say that it can be more difficult to show that that position is wrong because you have this unanimity. And you can say, well, obviously they're unanimous because they're focused on their profits. You now open that up because you say, well, there's not even unanimity among these companies as to whether being put under Title II regulation would be good or bad. And that blows the entire conversation back open, and it gets us beyond just, oh, it's only about profits.
Yeah, it is great now to have one of these gigantic companies on our side, at least appearing to be on our side in this conversation.
Yeah, although it might be because of the inevitability and PR benefits of it, but at least publicly it is a good thing and it opens up some conversation, some at least not bad news when it comes to preserving internet freedom. We have a great program for you today. It is Friday. We have audience questions to answer and so much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We depend on our audience for funding this program. People often ask me, David, how do you pay for this show? How is this show funded? It is not through advertising contracts with big corporations or through big media conglomerates. It is mostly through the membership program, which gets you access to the commercial-free podcast feed, the bonus show, the full 1-hour television program for members only, and very cool events like members-only town hall video conferences with us like we had earlier this week. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up, and you could one day be member of the day like Lynn Fletcher is today. Lynn Fletcher is today's member of the day. Join Lynn at davidpakman.com/membership. And remember, you can support the work we're doing with the shopping you do on Amazon.com. Before shopping on Amazon, go to our website, davidpakman.com, and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. Bookmark that link and use it when you shop to support our program. 5 years ago this week, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, a 7 magnitude earthquake, 16 miles from the capital city of Port-au-Prince, over 100,000 deaths, destruction of Haitian infrastructure, displacement close to 1 million people, and a very, very nasty cholera outbreak. It's very interesting to see two things. And interesting is a kind of privileged term because it means that you're not in danger and you have the time to analyze from the outside what happens with these disasters. Number one, you can really learn a lot about countries by the amount of destruction that similar natural disasters cause. And of course, countries with a less developed infrastructure suffer much more from similar natural disasters than other countries. Poor countries suffer much more from similar natural disasters than rich countries. But also looking at the response to these disasters can be pretty insightful. Pat Robertson suggested that Haiti had formed a pact with the devil, and that was why the earthquake happened there. Harold Ford Jr. liked hearing what George W. Bush had to say about the disaster. President Obama responded quickly, offered aid, and Rush Limbaugh thought that the response was too fast, and Fox does not air the Haiti telethon that was done. Remember, celebrities and musicians and athletes coming together for this fundraiser for Haiti, and Fox News, the one network that chose not to air that. There's really, aside from obviously all of the personal damage that is done by these incidents, we can really learn a lot about relationships and perceptions by the reactions to these events.
We can. And the countries, the way certain countries responded to the disaster is pretty insightful as well. Of course, the Dominican Republic, Haiti's neighbor, was the first to respond, and they did as much as they could. But of course, neither are rich countries, and Haiti was in a terrible position to start with, even before the disaster.
If there was an equivalent natural disaster in North Korea, the U.S. does send different varying amounts of aid depending on how much we're sanctioning in North Korea. The U.S. does send aid to countries that we're having political disagreements with. What do you think would happen if there was a similar disaster in North Korea? Would the U.S. be as involved?
It's hard to say. I think we would like to be, but that would totally depend on the regime. Would they allow aid workers into the country? I mean, how would they handle it? It's impossible to know for sure.
It is almost time for the next Super Bowl, Super Bowl 49. And 2 years ago this week, Beyonce was caught lip-syncing the national anthem at President Obama's 2013 inauguration. We've talked about lip-syncing at the Super Bowl and how I think, Lewis, it's standard policy that all performances are pre-recorded at the Super Bowl, right? In case anything goes wrong, they just don't want to chance it.
I think we've seen some recently that haven't been. I know Madonna was lip syncing for sure. It was incredibly obvious, although people were singing her praises. But
well, remember the Chili Peppers said that they were just told you have to do it this way. The
Right.
Chili Peppers play live. Typically, they were told you just have to do this because we can't chance it.
Yeah, well, I would refuse if I were the performing artist. But yeah, that's just me.
So a lot of people didn't care about this. There was this explanation from Beyonce after the inauguration that I hadn't had proper time to practice and to do a sound check, so we just did a pre-record. And there's varying degrees of people being upset with this, but personally, I cannot stand lip syncing. I understand sometimes there's more of a focus on dancing and the performance, and sometimes that type of thing can get in the way of proper singing, but I just want real singing. I don't know if it's too much to ask, but I have a strong preference for people who are actually performing, playing their instrument, and singing live.
Because of cell phone videos and things like that, it's clear that Beyonce has been lip syncing for quite some time. Maybe not all her shows, but in the pop world, and with all of these big superstars like Lady Gaga, Britney Spears in the past. I mean, all of these people, they lip sync all the time, and it's just it's sad that it's come to that. But I guess in a lot of ways, there's more of a focus on the dancing and their performance rather than the music.
And sometimes, Lewis, I think saying that they're lip syncing all the time may be a little bit of an overstatement. Very often they're kind of singing over a track, and they're really being helped by recordings. But I do think that maybe saying lip syncing all the time may be a bit of an overstatement.
I don't think it's an overstatement at all. I think it's pretty clear. I've watched many videos, and in pretty much all of these live performances of these superstars, it's very obvious that they're lip syncing.
1 year ago, yeah, go ahead, Lewis.
I was just say I can't stand it. You're a performer, you're a musician. Play the music.
1 year ago this week, Oregon bakery Sweet Cakes by Melissa lost the fight after refusing to make a cake for a lesbian couple's wedding. A few months earlier, they had to close their storefront and move their business in-home. The Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries found the business was guilty of discrimination. And after they closed, they left a note on the door saying, "This fight is not over. We will continue to stand strong. Your religious freedom is becoming not free anymore. This is ridiculous that we cannot practice our faith. The Lord is good, and we will continue to serve him with all our heart." Tony Perkins said that forcing businesses to serve gays is like forcing gays to go to church. Don't you think that if God was on their side on this one, he would have prevented this decision from the Oregon Bureau that decided that they were guilty of discrimination?
Or perhaps just given them an incredible influx of business, and they would be very prosperous. Yes, and I love how, according to them, their right to practice their religion just means their right to discriminate.
Yeah, the right to practice your religion goes as far and stops when it starts to discriminate and infringe upon others' freedom to move about the world without being discriminated against or oppressed or unduly burdened. And do whatever you want in your church, as long as you're not obviously killing people or committing crimes. Say whatever you want. Be unwelcoming to whoever you want. Keep it in your church. But when it comes to a business that is operating under the rules of the state and federal government that is where it is located, you need to play by certain rules. And those rules may be, you can't just tell somebody you're gay, so I'm not serving you. Of course, no one should patronize a business that has that point of view. And if I went in and they said that, and I was a part of a lesbian or gay couple, I wouldn't want them to be forced to serve me. I would want them to be fined for discriminating, but of course I would take my business elsewhere.
I would do the same, yes. And, well, they lost the battle. They were wrong. And I guess the good guys won this time. But this type of thing's happening all over the place.
Give us a like on Facebook. We are trying to get to 50,000 Facebook likes, and with your help, we can do it. Go to facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today's classic interview is with Jackson Katz. We talked about gender in American politics and news reporting. We have talked a lot over the last couple of years about issues related to gender. We've talked about so-called men's rights movements. We've talked about the impact of gender on politics and on elections. And as we are getting closer and closer to our next election, I thought it would be great to go back to this great conversation we had with Jackson Katz all the way back in 2011. This is 2 studios ago. So this was not at the Greenfield, Massachusetts studio. It was at the Northampton, Massachusetts studio a ways back, but still a very relevant conversation with Jackson Katz. Let's check it out. All right, Jackson Katz is here, anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. Also somebody that I know from taking classes with Sut Jolly and having him show all sorts of different documentaries. He made you somewhat, I don't know if I'd say a star, but a well-known figure at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I've been reading a lot of your Huffington Post stuff. I've been looking at some of the topics from your upcoming book. And I'm interested to talk. Your expertise covers a broad range of specific areas we could focus on. But I'd love to talk about the presidency, the Tea Party, the 2012 election, and kind of where you see gender, masculinity fitting in there. But to get into that, it might be good to step back and say, over the last 10, 15 years, what has been the role of gender in politics, elections, kind of as an overall picture?
Well, sure. Well, when most people hear the word gender and politics together, they assume that it's a discussion about women and women's political choices or women's voting patterns or women as candidates. And of course, those are all important issues. But the focus of my work has been on looking at how men are gendered beings and how men's political choices and men as candidates are gendered as well. And that's a discourse that I think is incredibly important in American politics and presidential politics specifically that rarely gets discussed. And so the lens that I use, if you will, to look at the last 30, 40, 50, 100 years of American politics, certainly in the media era, is the gendered lens looking at men and masculinity. And my basic point is that gender is always an issue in presidential politics. It's always an issue. But only when a woman is running, like when Hillary Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination in 2008, do people actually talk about gender. But even when two men are running against each other, gender is a central force in presidential politics.
And it's just interesting you mentioned, usually when someone says gender, you're thinking of women. And I think this applies when there's discussions of race. I think people's minds go to either black people or brown people, Hispanic people, what have you. When there's a discussion of class, your thought goes to poor people.
Right. Well, what you're describing is how dominance functions by stealth or invisibility. And so making visible what has been rendered invisible is one of the most, I think, important progressive projects, whether it's in politics about racism or heterosexism or sexism. Making the dominant group visible and examining the mechanisms by which it maintains its dominance is a key, it's a key act of, progressive transformation. Even issues as ranging as prostitution and sex trafficking. It's looking at instead of looking at the supply side, like the prostitutes, you look at the demand side. The demand side meaning men who are buying sex. This is all of this is about shifting focus off of the subordinated groups or the oppressed, if you will, groups, and looking critically at the dominant group and how it maintains its privilege.
So to be really specific, when we think back to the 2008 election, after it became clear that Hillary Clinton was not going to be the Democratic nominee, John McCain, Barack Obama, two men, not two white men for once, so that was something a little bit different to start with. Let's be specific about how gender was a factor. I mean, I think many people who will see this will say, okay, I get what you're saying, that when someone says gender, you're thinking of women, and the fact that the two of them are men is also important. How is it a factor? What questions aren't being asked? What aren't we seeing in the media? Let's get into it.
Sure. Well, the first thing I think that I look at in my work, and I think it's really fundamental and basic, is that there is a persistent gender gap in voting patterns in the United States, and among white men in particular. White men have been voting radically disproportionately for the Republican nominee for president for the last 40 years. And in working class white men, and men, there's different ways of defining working class, but with a high school education, men with a high school education voted in 2000 for George Bush by something like 27 points over Al Gore. And Kerry, about 25% voted for Bush over Kerry in 2004. Barack Obama cut into that pretty significantly in 2008, although he still lost the white men's vote.
That's right.
But he lost it by about 16 percentage points. So he made some significant inroads into the white men's vote. But if you look at white male voting patterns, the only way the Democrat can win at the national level in the presidency is if they win such a dramatic percentage of the women's vote that it offsets their deficit among the white male vote.
That's right.
And so how can we not talk about gender? Why are white men so dramatically voting for the Republican candidate for president? Now, some people, of course, since the Civil Rights Act, have been talking about race as one of the central forces subtextually at work in presidential politics.
And it's being talked about looking forward also because of the increasing Hispanic population and how that will play a factor.
That's right. And of course, Obama being an African-American, that brought to the surface a lot of discussions about race and politics and such that had always been there, but they were talked about even more explicitly. Would white people vote for an African-American for president, et cetera? My thinking is that it's not just that white men are voting as a racialized bloc for the Republican candidate, although that's a big part of it. They're also voting in a gender sense as men, because especially since the late 60s and early 70s, and then increasingly after the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, the way that the two-party system has been sort of shaken out, if you will, in the gender binary is the Republican Party is the party of real men,
right,
and the Democratic Party is the party of women and feminized men, and that has heterosexist implications as well,
sure,
because the Democratic Party is seen as the party of gay rights, if you will, in addition to the men in the Democratic Party feminized in the national discourse. And I think this is a cultural political analysis, right? I think that this is an incredibly important reason why lots of white men, including working and middle-class white men, vote against their economic interests, at least as some of us understand those economic interests.
No question about it.
Right. So this complicates the analysis of, say, Thomas Frank and others who have been trying to figure out why so many Americans, especially white Americans, have voted against their economic interests for the past generation.
You mentioned the issue of gay rights, and we saw that really incredibly directly and just at the forefront in the discussion of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, I interviewed people who said the reason we shouldn't have homosexuals serving openly in the military is because the American military is manly. And implicit in that, even though it's not discussed, is that there's something bad about femininity and women in the military. And when I challenged some of those people directly, it was made very clear that that is involved in that subtext, just barely underneath the surface. But other than that particular issue, what else is it that has driven this white male voting bloc towards the Republican candidate?
In my book that I'm working on and just about to complete, I look at 3 issues. There's so many issues, and so you have to really narrow it. But
or the major ones,
yes,
maybe.
Yeah, sure. I looked at 3 issues that all involve violence, and they all involve important political issues over the past 40, 50 years. The first one is the Cold War. The second one is the rise of street crime as a domestic political issue in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And the discussion about violent crime, street crime, has a definitely racialized undertone to it. And then the rise of terrorism as a political issue in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. All 3 of those issues, Cold War, domestic crime, and terrorism, have to do with violence. And the president is a stand-in a certain sense, the symbolic leader of the country. He embodies, if you will, the national masculinity in a very important sense. People talk about the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the mourner-in-chief when national tragedy happens, the first family. He's the one who everybody salutes to and everybody stands when he enters the room. He really does, in a certain sense, represent the country.
And how can we prove that it's a gender thing? Because 2 of those 3 issues you mentioned, just at a very superficial analysis, to me feel like they are race issues. I mean, terrorism, we think of Muslims as the picture that's being painted, right?
Yep.
And street crime, black people for sure, and we see that
yes,
black people are incarcerated at much higher levels, percentage-wise. So sell the idea that it is actually gendered in there somewhere.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate your point here. It's a racialized gender analysis.
Okay.
So it's not. I'm not saying it's one or the other.
Sure.
I'm saying that let's add gender to our understanding of what have been understood as racialized issues. So, for example, the street crime issue, which emerged in the 1960s and 1970s as an important political issue that the right really ran with, if you will. If you listen to the kind of rhetoric that was thrown at Democrats and liberals and progressives about crime, it was things like you're soft on crime, you're coddling criminals. Who coddles somebody in the real world?
Mothers
coddle babies, right? So in other words, it's feminizing. In other words, what we need is a tough man, a tough white man in that racially subtextual sense, to get tough with these African-American rioters and criminals. And the liberals are a bunch of wimps and wusses and feminized men who aren't up to that task. That's an example of a gendered racial subtext. And terrorism is similar. Tough on terrorism versus soft on terrorism. And it's amazing how the Republican Party has been able to frame the Democratic Party, which includes a lot of kinds of guys who are veterans like John Kerry, who had actually proven, quote unquote, their valor in war in ways that some of the Republican candidates like George W. Bush haven't. In spite of that real world record, they've been able to feminize these men. And in part, by the way, the Kerry piece he was feminized in a class sense because of his class baggage, if you will. And for example, the picture of him what's the word? Skiing on the...
He was windsurfing
off of like in Nantucket or something. Yeah. While his advisors might have thought that made him look athletic and made him look robust.
The read is
elitist. And by the way, even the term elitist is a gendered term. It's one of the ways that wealthy men have been feminized by a certain working class discourse.
Sure.
As a way of saying that they might have money, they might have more status, and in an abstract sense, they might have more power, but they're kind of wusses. They're kind of not really manly. There's an anti-intellectualism that runs deep in American culture, and Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, published in, I think, 1964, I think it's currently applicable today. It's a brilliant analysis of the roots of anti-intellectualism, but anti-intellectualism has a gendered tone because in male culture, intellectual achievement is often seen as, when I say male culture, I'm talking about like sort of sports bar kind of guy culture, kind of the mainstream, sort of guy culture. Intellectual attainment and polysyllabic speech is gendered feminine. Like, guys don't talk like that. So look at George W. Bush. I mean, downplaying his aristocratic roots, downplaying his Ivy League education, affecting a Texas blue-collar swagger, and being seen, therefore, somehow as more authentic. As a guy who you could relate to, as then say somebody like John Kerry, who's much more erudite, who's much more intellectual and cerebral. Al Gore, another example. I mean, so this is how it plays out in a cultural, political way. The elitism as sort of masculine effeminacy.
Can we talk a little bit about Sarah Palin specifically, and if we include Michelle Bachmann or Christine O'Donnell in that, fine. Something we saw a lot in the recent years has been some women's groups have criticized those who criticize Sarah Palin as saying that what's behind the criticism is that Sarah Palin is a woman. And it has been turned in a way that I haven't seen recently into Democrats are the ones who are against women's rights. What's your thought about that narrative and generally about what we've seen around Sarah Palin and other candidates?
Well, it's a complicated. Sarah Palin is as we would say in the academic sense, a complicated text. There's no question about it, and that's one of the reasons why she's a compelling sort of cultural figure. Yeah. However, some of us might feel about her politics. She has something. She represents something that's very interesting. And one of the things, to be honest, David, that I'm most interested in about Sarah Palin is how she's popular with a lot of white male conservative men who are sexist and traditionalist, and the idea of them supporting for president, and that now again, who knows if that's going to end up happening? She's never ran for a president, but
I don't believe it will.
Okay, but she was in that discourse, and she still is, right? The idea that a white conservative man would potentially support her for president is really notable, and I have to think, why is that? What about what Sarah Palin is saying and doing and representing would cause a white man who does a conservative, traditionalist, sexist white man or chauvinist white man to support her? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is what's going on is that she attacks liberal and progressive men's masculinity whenever she has the opportunity, which has the effect of supporting conservative men's masculinity. In other words, she boosts. Michelle Bachmann does it. Ann Coulter. That's one of the features of Ann Coulter's public life is that she goes on college campuses and elsewhere and just ridicules progressive and liberal men. And young conservative guys are eating it up because what she's basically saying is those guys who disagree with you, those guys who stand with the feminists and stand with progressive activists, they're a bunch of neutered wimps. Real men are right-wing Republicans.
And Christine O'Donnell, we would talk about her key and choice phrases during her campaign. She actually said her male opponent needed to man up. So it was not that she was able to get in on the action too.
That's right. And Sharon Engel said something similar as well.
That's right, yeah.
There is some criticism of Sarah Palin from the left that is sexist in its nature. And I think obviously that's the tricky part, because how do you criticize her and really identify the offensive nature of some of the things that she says and believes without playing into the sexism? It's a complicated it's a complicated task.
To take a bigger picture look in the last couple of minutes here, to you, just your opinion, is the ideal scenario one where gender would be such a non-issue when we are electing candidates or whatever that it would not even warrant discussion? I mean, is that the ideal scenario? Or no matter what, is gender on the list of whatever else is on that list, it doesn't matter, that is always worth discussion, no matter what happens in terms of the discourse in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways to think about that is the same way that some people would look at, do we live in a post-racial society or do we not? And I think it's obvious that we do not.
Right.
And even though we elected an African-American man president, of course, racism and race is incredibly important. And I don't see in my lifetime that it's not going to be incredibly important. And I think gender is the same thing. And maybe someday in some, far distant future, gender won't be significant, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
But my question is, given that there are a number of different things that we can discuss about what make people different, right?
Uh-huh.
And we could have a long laundry list, hundreds, maybe even thousands of things. Is gender such an important one, separate from where we are today because of what's happened and all of the things that you and I have discussed so far? Is it such an inherent part of how people are different that it always warrants discussion? Or could you imagine a situation where gender is no longer something that is do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, but I think that's utopian. I think
it's completely utopian.
It's so far in the future that it's like science fiction.
Yeah.
Sophisticated thinking requires us to make intersectional observations about gender and race and class and how it's all embedded. And if we got more men and women engaged in this conversation, I think its power, that is gender's power as a dividing force, if you will, would be diminished. But I think we would have more progressive politics if there was more consciousness about how, sort of masculinity is linked to conservative ways of thinking about the world, which affects politics. If we could make that visible, it would have less power, and therefore we'd have more progressive politics.
I would take it a step further, and what we've been saying for years on the show, if we had more nuanced, cross-platform, cross-genre analysis of almost any issue, we would have more progressive politics and more progressive people. That's just my thought. Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, expert on violence, media, masculinity. Great to have you in studio today. And your website, jacksonkatz.com.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Taking your questions. It is Friday, and we like to answer audience questions. Send them in. Olana wrote in and said, how important is physical attractiveness for a significant other? This is a really tough question to answer, Lewis, because initially, I think physical attractiveness is very, very important in relationships. And then, as the bonds are built between people over time, you would imagine that physical attractiveness becomes less important in terms of the desire to remain together, okay? However, there's no question, and you and I both know people, of course, who are with someone who over time, their level of physical attraction to their partner may change. And this could certainly impact their sexual relationship, right? And depending on where they are, I think every situation is very unique. It might influence their desire to be with the person as a partner, separate from their desire to have a sexual relationship with that partner. So I don't know that there's any single answer. Everybody is very different.
I think everyone is different, and there are unique, all unique situations. It clearly, in most situations, starts with some type of physical attraction. That's usually how it begins. So I think maybe for you to get the ball rolling, I think it is important for there to be that physical attraction, isn't it? Isn't that important?
I happen to agree with you, and there are different analyses. People can disagree about how important physical attractiveness should be, right? That's a different question, which is, well, maybe people really shouldn't care about physical attractiveness. And if people didn't care about physical attractiveness, we would have such a lower divorce rate because people would really focus only on the compatibility when it comes to personality and whether people's minds are compatible. And thus, you wouldn't have this thing of physical attractiveness, which can change much more than who a person is intellectually or emotionally, although people might disagree about that. And thus, you would reduce the divorce rate if you did that. But at the same time, I think that ignores just kind of empirical realities about humans, which is that humans are visual, humans are physical, humans are sexual in a way that I think is directly connected to physical appearance.
Undeniably, I think it's interesting. I think when it comes to physical attractiveness, our society, I think to some extent, dictates to people what is attractive.
Right.
And there are lots of, I know this just is bull. There are many situations in which I've had friends say, my buddy says, I'm really attracted to this girl. I don't even know why. She's like, she doesn't really fit what his idea of attractive is, but society dictated that idea. And there are things that he's attracted to that he doesn't even realize. And I think that physical attractiveness is just a very powerful thing. And I think that's what kicks it all off.
Now, there's another thing you're kind of getting at, which I think is interesting, which is physical attractiveness being important to people in terms of a partner doesn't mean that it has to be physical attractiveness that fits whatever popular culture has decided is attractive now. So I'm by no means saying that physical attractiveness as portrayed by Hollywood, for example, is important per se. It's whatever physical attractiveness means to a particular individual, and that's an important distinction to make.
Indeed. But there are a lot of people who are very confused about that because of the society we live in.
Next question is from Trisha. How would either of you react if one of your kids joined Islam? Okay, my thoughts on this don't have that much to do with Islam, I must say, but to some extent they would. So I consider myself culturally Jewish. If I were to have a kid, I would raise the kid to be culturally Jewish. That would not include a bar or bat mitzvah. I did not have a bar mitzvah. But certainly I would want my kids to be aware of the history of Judaism. I would want my children to travel to Israel and to understand what Israel is and why it's important, and to understand so many of these things and the traditions and the food, all of that stuff. If my child were to take any religion and become I guess what we would call an enthusiastic adherent to a religion, whether it was Orthodox Judaism or conservative Islam or fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, I would be concerned in all of those cases, okay? Is there something in particular about Islam at its face that would be more concerning? I will say no, kind of broadly speaking, but I would add that pragmatically speaking, many of there is a higher rate of extremism amongst those who convert to religions than among those who are sort of born into them, whatever it is that we determine that to mean. So if there was a conversion at all, that would also be somewhat concerning to me. But would it be specifically about Islam? No.
I think that I would probably do the same thing as David. I would probably maybe not necessarily raise my kids as Jewish or as necessarily as culturally Jewish, but I would certainly expose them to everything I was exposed to as a cultural Jew growing up. And I think I would just be furious if one of my kids decided to take up a religion, because I just think that religion is nonsense. And so
would you sever ties though?
No, I would not sever ties. I would try to explain things. I would try to make them see the light, if you will. But yeah, Islam, like David said, there is something strange to me about someone who converts to a religion seemingly out of the blue.
The exception, I would say, and I know people who have done this, is a conversion to kind of be the same religion as their partner. I've seen that happen.
Right.
And every time I've seen that happen personally, it was more for the families of the partner, not for the partner themselves. But even still, in the conversions I saw, it was very kind of a secular conversion, you know?
If one of my kids were to convert, I would rather see them convert to a religion that I find to be a bit more interesting, perhaps Sikhism or something like that. I wouldn't want it to be one of the really popular religions because that's just selling out.
All right, well, that's certainly an interesting point of view. Send me your thoughts on this one. Let me know what you think. Last question today is from Caleb. Hey guys, how often do you argue religion or politics in your personal life? Have you ever had to cut ties with a friend or loved one because of a disagreement on those topics? I've alluded to this before. I basically do not talk about politics or religion in my personal life outside of discussions with my immediate family, right? So I'll go visit my dad or my mom or talk with former TV director Natan about stuff. I will have political discussions, but essentially I do not have religious or political discussions, period. Very often it will happen in social situations that when people find out what I do, they want to have me comment on something, and I won't refuse, but I will just try really not to. And it's more because I just, I feel like I talk about that enough, and I usually just have other things I would rather talk about with people.
I try to avoid this at all costs. I don't see the point. I guess I'm more likely to talk about religion than I am politics. I think I can keep a cooler head when talking about religion, and I don't think I've ever had to cut ties with a friend or loved one because of this, because of a disagreement on one of these topics. I think that perhaps that is because I avoid talking about it, and I avoid. In some cases, I just avoid becoming friends with people that I think might have opinions that are the opposite of mine.
I've had a couple tie cuttings, so to speak, but only one of them was like deliberate, right? So in the way that you're saying, Lewis, that you would just kind of avoid even getting into those friendships, so to speak, I've had situations where I didn't cut ties per se, but I was exposed to the fact that a couple of friends one was very anti-gay. The other was vehemently anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish in a way that was completely offensive to me, dismissive of the history of anti-Semitism, dismissive of any of the empirical realities around that. And it became so unpleasant to even be around this person that the relationship just kind of naturally evaporated. And there's a couple people that has happened with. The time where I deliberately cut ties, and fortunately the ties have been retied, was when a friend expressed that I mentioned I was going to a gay wedding years ago, and they said that they don't agree with that. And I said, we don't agree with what? The fact that gay people exist, or the fact that in some states at the time, not that many states, they can get married? And they basically just went on what was a pretty anti-gay diatribe. And I just said, okay, well, I can't be in touch with you if this is your point of view. I'm not friends with people that believe these things. And we did not speak for something like 9 months. And eventually, at the behest of his then girlfriend, he reached back out to me and said, listen, I've been telling people about the disagreement we had, and I realized that I was wrong, and I'm apologizing, and I'm reaching out to you. I want to be in touch again. And this person is now one of my better friends again. They have friends who are gay, lesbian. They, with complete lack of any seeming ulterior calculated motives, will bring up things related to gay marriages and same-sex relationships. And it's a change that I was skeptical to believe at the beginning was a real one, but I've been convinced of over the last 5 or so years.
I've certainly never had any situation like that. I do have some very good friends who I know would disagree with me on pretty much everything. But they're not idiots. I mean, they know that bringing this stuff up with me is not a good idea. I don't bring it up with them. We don't discuss it. We just talk about the things we have in common, and it's just it's avoided, and we stay friendly.
All right, there it is. Great questions this week. Keep your questions coming via email, via Twitter, via Facebook, or via our voicemail number 219-2DavidP. And remember that the show doesn't have to end now, even though it is the end of the Friday show. You don't have to wait until Monday for more show, because if you remember, the next thing you could listen to or watch is the bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.